God has specifically chosen you to be here at this time and in this place. You have incredible potential, purpose, and calling to push back the darkness and be a light for Christ. Stand for nothing and you'll fall for anything. It's time to stand your ground. This is Unapologetic. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unapologetic. I'm so excited to have my dad with us today, Dr. Robert Jeffress. He is going to talk to us about the very popular topic of deconstruction and anxiety. He's also going to share with us about his new book, Invincible. And I'm so excited to have him on today. Not only is he my dad, he is also my lifelong favorite pastor, and I know you will get a lot out of today's talk. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Dad.
Hello, Julia. Good to be with you. And by the way, congratulations on the success of Unapologetic. We're really proud of you.
Thank you. That's so nice. So let's start out asking the question we always ask. What do you wish Christians would stop apologizing for?
I wish Christians would stop apologizing for the very cornerstone of the Christian faith, and that is that faith in Jesus Christ is the only way a person can be saved. You know, the latest statistics show that 60% of so-called evangelical Christians believe now that there's more than one way to heaven other than faith in Jesus Christ. And we've allowed people to badger us into believing that when you tell people Christ is the only way, that that's somehow hateful or intolerant. The fact is, Jesus was very intolerant when it came to salvation. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. He said that not because he hated people, but because he loved people. He wasn't trying to keep people out of heaven. He was trying to show them the only way into heaven. And yet, you know, I think it's the absolute height of hubris when Christians say, well, I'm going to be more tolerant than Jesus is. No, the most unloving thing you can do is to lead somebody to hell by not telling them the truth of the gospel.
Wow, what a great answer. What do you attribute the cause being of evangelicals now saying that there's more than one way to heaven?
I think that a lot of evangelicals have confused diversity with pluralism. There's a difference. Diversity is the recognition that there are many different belief systems out there, and there are. But pluralism goes one step further and says all belief systems are equally valid. And I think in America, as we become more diverse, not only ethnically but theologically, we make that final step in saying, well, therefore, all beliefs are equal. No, all beliefs are not equal. Even though we respect in our country the right of people to choose to be wrong, you know, freedom is the right to be wrong about certain things, it doesn't make all belief systems right. And I think Christians are confused about that.
I'm at the advantage of knowing your material, so that's kind of different in this situation. But can you give your analogy, the example that you give for our listeners of the plane?
Yeah. You know, it was interesting. A few years ago, I was on a plane headed to, I forgot where I was going, but I was talking to a man next to me. And when he found out I was a pastor and a writer, he said, I used to be a Christian, but I gave it up. And I said, well, why did you give up being a Christian? He said, I could never reconcile belief in a God who was so hateful and intolerant that he would send people to hell for not believing in his son, Jesus Christ. And I said to him at the moment, I said, I want you to imagine for a moment this plane were to crash, and that flight attendant up at the front were to start waving a flashlight and saying, follow me, there is only one way out of this burning aircraft. Would you accuse her of being hateful or intolerant because she said there's only one way out? No, you would follow her and you would thank her. And it's the same with us. I mean, we are not hurting people when we tell them there's one way out of this planet that's going to be destroyed one day. We're doing the most loving thing we can do.
Right. That's fantastic. That's such a good, that analogy. I've heard it another way with the house on fire and the firemen coming saying this is the way out. Of course, like you wouldn't be upset at that person. You would thank them.
I'll tell you an interesting story. This just happened a couple of years ago. I was at the Reagan Library in California doing a seminar. It was called Ask a Jew, Ask a Gentile.
Wow.
And Salem Media sponsored it, and the place was absolutely filled up with people. It was me and Salem talk show host Dennis Prager, who's a very Orthodox Jew, and people could ask us any question they wanted to. And somebody asked Dennis Prager, what do you think about Dr. Jeffress saying that Jews have to accept Jesus to go to heaven, and if they don't, they're going to hell? Aren't you offended by that? And he said, if I believed the way Robert believed, I would think the most unloving thing he could do would be not to share with me the only way to heaven. I see what he does as a sign of love, not of hatred. And that flabbergasted the audience. But he was intellectually honest enough to believe that it's not hateful to share the one way to heaven if you truly believe there's one way to heaven. And by the way, I just remind people, I didn't come up with that truth. Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, said there's one way to heaven. Peter, on the day of Pentecost, was a Jew who said there's one way to heaven. And the Apostle Paul called himself the Hebrew of the Hebrews, the Jews of the Jews. But he said, I would give my life if Israel could be saved. So again, the most three prominent Jews of the New Testament all believed there was one way to heaven.
I didn't tell you we were going to talk about this and that I was going to ask you, but I meet very few people in my generation that understand why America is historically pro-Israel. Do you mind speaking to that?
Well, the fact is, America has not always been pro-Israel. But in 1948, Harry Truman, who was the president, gave birth to the modern nation of Israel. And remember that after the Romans in 100 AD, they burned the temple in 70 AD, there was the great dispersion of the Jews. For 2,000 years ago, they were dispersed throughout the entire world. But God brought them back together. And in 1948, there was a settlement, an international settlement, and Harry Truman signed on to the belief that Israel was a nation and they deserved to have their own homeland. And you know, when people say, oh, these terrible Jewish people, they've displaced the Palestinians. This land didn't belong to the Palestinians. It belonged to Israel for thousands of years earlier. We have evidence now that there was a King David. We found evidence of King David's rule over Israel in 1000 BC. This land was given to the Israelites by God, and now they are reclaiming the land that has belonged to them since Genesis 12 when God gave it to them.
I think I misspoke a little bit. I didn't necessarily mean America being pro-Israel. Can you explain why Christians? Why are we still?
Well, it's very easy to answer that. In Genesis 12, God called Abraham and said, I'm going to make you a great nation, and I will bless those who bless you and your descendants, and I will curse those who curse you and your descendants. And quite frankly, to be on the wrong side of Israel is to be on the wrong side of God. God said, I'm going to create this people, the Jewish people. They're going to be a human object lesson of what happens to people who follow after me or people who reject me. And Israel's gone through times of blessings when they walked with God and a time of cursing when they disobeyed God. And I would just say again, it doesn't mean everything Israel does is right, but it means that we need to understand from a biblical sense they are God's chosen people. And of course, on a practical sense, for us as a country, the United States of America, they're our only ally in the Middle East right now who stands with us.
That was a great explanation. Okay, I want to talk about deconstruction. That's a huge topic right now. A lot of people are falling away from their faith because of thinking that they need to deconstruct, they need to start really examining their beliefs. And I think just as someone who's been in student ministry for over a decade, I'm annoyed that deconstruction, that term, is being totally just overtaken by just a different school of thought, because the truth is that we do need to examine what we believe.
Yes.
We do need to know why we believe Jesus is the only way to heaven, why we believe the Bible is true, why we believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So can you help just listeners kind of understand why deconstruction, in the sense that it's being used right now, is pretty dangerous?
Yeah, and I think you make a good distinction. We ought to have an answer, as Peter said, to anyone who asks us for the hope that is within us. We ought to know why we believe what we believe to be true. And there are logical reasons for that. And I think there's a time that comes in every person's life. I think there's that troubling time for a lot of teenagers when they have to decide what they're going to do with the faith of their parents, whether they're going to embrace it or reject it. And sometimes that's an uneasy process when teenagers have to decide for themselves what they're going to believe. And a lot of parents get upset when their kids are asking questions. There's nothing wrong with asking the questions as long as you provide the answers. And my own experience. I was called to the ministry when I was in high school, and I was on fire for God, leading Bible studies, reading the Bible voraciously. And then I went to Baylor University, and I had religion teachers there that denied that the Bible was the Word of God. They said the Bible is a collection of man's ideas of God. They talked about all the errors and inconsistencies in the Bible, and it was a real crisis of faith for me. And instantly I started quit reading the Bible, quit witnessing. I really questioned whether I wanted to go into ministry. I said, why do I want to spend my life preaching a book that's filled with untruths? And it was a crisis of unbelief. Fortunately, I went from there to Dallas Theological Seminary, which at that time had some great professors who stood for the inerrancy of Scripture, and they had a great way of explaining, people who were graduates of Harvard and other respective institutions who could explain why you don't have to commit intellectual suicide to be a Christian, that there are logical reasons to believe that the Bible is true. And so I went through a crisis of faith, but fortunately I went to the right place for the right answers. And this is what I would say about deconstruction. It's kind of like peeling an onion. If you keep peeling, you end up with nothing.
Right.
And I think there's a difference between doubt and unbelief. In fact, I talk about that in my first chapter of Invincible, moving from doubt to faith. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. Jesus never condemned people who asked sincere questions. What he condemned was unbelief. And I would say whether it's you who are listening right now on this podcast or somebody who's having doubts, the important thing is to make sure these seeds of doubt don't turn into unbelief. Somebody has said that doubt is like a mushroom. It grows best in the darkness. And when you do have these seeds of doubt, go to somebody who has credible answers. Don't listen to unbelievers. Listen to people who have gone through a similar experience and the answers that they found. Get plugged into a Bible-believing church where you can hear credible answers to the questions you have. And to get around more mature Christians who may have gone through the very same questions you did. And I think you can eliminate doubt if you deal with it decisively.
That's a fabulous answer. And I just want to say to everyone listening, I had the benefit, of course, and the blessing of having you as my dad, still obviously, but you were able to answer my questions. There was not even a chance of doubt coming into my mind because my parents could answer my questions. And someone listening could say, well, okay, but your dad's a pastor and a theologian and an author of Christian books. But we live in a wonderful time where you can find the answers. We have access to information. We have the internet. Anyone can find the answer if you're trying to look for it.
Don't go to unbelievers to find reasons for belief.
Right. But I think for parents, it's really important to be able to answer your children's questions. And even if you don't feel like you have the answer, being able to direct them to someone who does.
Yeah, it's important too. And as we're taping this podcast right now, we're getting ready in our church to have Lee Strobel in our church. And for those of your listeners who don't know his story, I mean, he was a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter for the Chicago Tribune. He was an atheist. His wife was a Christian, but he was an atheist. And he did, as an investigative reporter, an honest search for the truth about the resurrection and other claims of Christianity. And when he finished his objective search, he found that the evidence for the resurrection was overwhelming. And his search became the basis for those best-selling books, The Case for Faith and then The Case for Christ. Those are two excellent resources I would recommend people go to. Again, I'm not here to plug books, but
I was going to plug yours.
We
my
use
favorite.
this in our church, and I know you use it with our teenagers and other young adults you minister to. How can I know? Answers to life's most important questions. And we deal with the 7 things that people ask most about. How can I know there is a God? How can I know there really is a heaven? How can I know Christianity's the right religion? We take 7 of those questions, and what I did was I spent a year on the book. I went to the best sources for every question, and realizing that most people weren't going to read a 500-page book on any one of those topics, I distilled, hundreds and hundreds of pages into 30 pages for each chapter, each question, to answer in a layman's way how you can know these things are true.
And we still give that to every senior who's graduating our student ministry. And I think something that's really important and that we try to teach teenagers and young adults is having that knowledge before they're faced with some crisis.
Yeah.
Really,
That's right.
I mean, you're storing it up so you have those verses, you have that knowledge before then you're in a class where a professor is trying to discount the Bible and the gospel.
Yeah.
We talked before we were filming, and I was telling you how I just keep thinking of Romans 1, claiming to be wise, they became fools. And just with transgender and with deconstruction and with faith and just the whole way that culture's going right now, because there's this idea that if you're really intelligent and you're really wise and you really understand the world, then you wouldn't be a Christian. You wouldn't. And so can you speak to that?
Yeah, in fact, there's just a poll that came out yesterday that showed an inverse relationship between the level of education people receive and their belief in God. And, quote, the more educated you are, the less you believe in God. Well, I mean, again, that verse from Paul, seeking to be wise, they became fools. And the wisdom of the cross is foolishness to man. And the wisdom of man is foolishness to God. I think we've allowed the secular world to set up a false dichotomy between God and science, for example. There is no contradiction between God and science. God is the God of science. And what people forget is, in history, some of the greatest men and women of faith, Christians, were also great men and women of science. Isaac Newton, Blaise Pascal, Louis Pasteur. These were all men of science, but they were men of faith who believed that there is a God who created the world in such an orderly fashion that the world could be studied and we could benefit from those studies. And so it's a false dichotomy to say there's a conflict between God and science. And I would just say one more thing. The psalmist said, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. That word fool in Hebrew literally means moron. You have to be a moron to believe that this world just happened out of nothing. You have to be a moron to believe that something as intricate as the eyeball, as even Charles Darwin admitted, or the human body could have just evolved. There's not enough time for it to evolve. I mean, the reason people become unbelievers is not because they have found all of this evidence that there is no God. They have ignored the evidence that is out there, and they have refused to submit to a God who is there. I heard somebody say one time, a person's morality determines his theology, and immoral people do not want to believe there's a God to whom they're accountable. So they say, well, if I just shut my eyes and say he's not there, maybe he will disappear. Well, it doesn't work that way.
And can you give the example you give of the thief, why a thief can't find
Yeah, yeah. The same way many unbelievers can't find God is the same reason a thief can't find a policeman.
Exactly. And I have a real sophisticated way of explaining it to teenagers. If it sounds weird, it's because it usually is.
Yeah, that's right.
If it sounds weird in culture or from schools or your friends, it's because it usually is weird.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense. And God has given us the ability to have discernment.
You know, I'm going to go back a little bit because in this first chapter of Invincible, when I talk about moving from doubt to unbelief, I use the story of Thomas. He's known as the doubting apostle. And remember, he was, like all the apostles, were disappointed on that Friday afternoon after Jesus was crucified. All of their dreams evaporated. And the apostles got together that Sunday night, but Thomas wasn't there. And when they got together, Jesus appeared in his resurrected form, but Thomas missed out on it because he was separated from the rest of the body of believers. He didn't get to see the resurrected Christ until later, but he missed out on that benefit. And I would just say right now to those listening to this podcast, this pandemic has caused many people to become separated, isolated from other believers. Remember, unbelief grows in the darkness. And that's why it is so important for you, if you're listening to this, you're starting to have doubts, get reconnected with a church, get reconnected to other believers, and you'll find a lot of your doubts evaporate.
Oh, that's such a good word. I love your book, Invincible. I'm really glad that you talk about Matthew 17. And in Matthew 17, for listeners, if you don't know, maybe you do, it talks about having faith as small as a mustard seed. And if you say to this mountain, move from here to there, it will move.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, look, my book, Invincible, the subtitle is Conquering the Mountains That Separate You from the Blessed Life. And in the Bible, mountains are a metaphor for obstacles that separate God's people from God's blessings. And you know, over these last 18 months, we've all dealt with a lot of different mountains, the mountains of loneliness, the mountains of doubt, of fear, of anxiety. And the mountains are different sizes for different people, but they're there. That verse you reference, when Jesus says, if you have the faith as tiny as a mustard seed, you can move mountains, he wasn't speaking literally, but he was speaking truthfully, and there's a difference. He was saying that you don't have to allow these mountains to conquer you. You can conquer them with God's help before they conquer you. There's no word of faith you can say that says, anxiety, be gone. Fear, be gone. Loneliness, be gone. The fact is, as I talk about in Invincible, there's only one productive thing in your life that God refuses to have you have any part in, and that's your salvation. Salvation is God's work alone, for by grace we have been saved through faith. But just about every other thing we accomplish in life is a partnership between God and us. You know, God told the Israelites, I'm going to give you this promised land. But then he said, you're going to have to fight for every square inch of it.
Wow.
And whether we're dealing with anxiety or fear or grief, God plays his part, but we have to play our part as well. In management, we talk a lot about upward delegation, where a subordinate will try to take a task that's been given to him by his boss, and he tries to give it back to his boss and says, I can't do this. I want you to take it. Well, a wise boss says, no, I gave it to you. You do it. Well, for example, fear. God says, don't worry about anything. Pray about everything. He doesn't say, give me all of your fear and I will eliminate it. We have to do it together. And so I think we need to, Julia, get rid of this idea that there's any one thing we can do, any one prayer we can pray, any one decision we can make that will get rid of the mountains we face forever. It's a struggle. It's a lifelong struggle we're in. The good news is God says, I will take your mountains and turn them into molehills. And that's what the book Invincible's about.
I love that because I love stories. I love testimonies. Obviously, as a therapist, I mean, dedicating my life to listening to other people's stories. And I love hearing them. But there's a common theme that I hear amongst Christians, and you're not going to hear this in Sunday school, but you will hear it in the counseling room. And it's people feel very defeated when they hear someone say, and then I was in this worship service, or then I was having this prayer time with God, and this struggle or this problem or this huge issue in my life was just gone.
Yeah.
And I mean, sometimes that happens, but a lot of times it doesn't. And it makes a lot of people think, well, what's wrong with me that I'm still struggling with fill in the blank?
Yeah.
What can you say to that?
I would say that is the norm. People keep struggling. I think about my dad, your grandfather. You barely knew him before he died, but he had been a smoker since he was 9 years old. And he became a Christian when he was about 28, but he was still a smoker, and he battled with that. And, he wasn't one who believed smoking sends you to hell, but for him it was a spiritual struggle. And in 1982, when his company he worked for went bankrupt and he lost his job, he had a real spiritual renewal. I mean, it was dramatic. And he quit smoking immediately. He gave it up immediately. But he said, Robert, he said, every day I get up, I still have that craving for a cigarette. The craving is still there. He still does battle with it, even though he had victory over it. And I just think it's that way. As long as we have a fallen nature in us, it doesn't have to rule our lives. The power of Christ is greater than the power of the flesh, but we have to make a decision every day of whether to yield or not to those old desires that we still carry around with us. I think about the person Jesus ministered to, and he said, I believe, help me in my unbelief. Yes, you can make that decision to believe, but you need continual help.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, I want to talk about anxiety. I know anxiety is in your book. Most people listening know that's one of my favorite topics because it's something that is so prevalent and amongst Christians and non-Christians. And the Bible does have a lot to say about anxiety. So just prefacing this with, please do not stop taking your medicine without talking to a doctor. Please know that there is a difference between PTSD and trauma and really having those panic attacks that stem from that, and that generalized anxiety and fear and worry that comes from a lot of times not trusting God. So can you speak to that?
Well, I do talk in the book Invincible about different sources of anxiety. Sometimes anxiety comes from, when we are not doing something we know we should be doing. I mean, during the pandemic, people have put off going to the dentist, and they think, gee, I'm afraid to go to the dentist because I'm fearful what he might discover. Well, there's an easy remedy to that. Go to the dentist, confront your fear. Some of it has to do with guilt. David talked about during his time of estrangement from God when he refused to confess his sin. God's Spirit was upon him. He had this feeling that God was going to punish him and so forth. That was a legitimate source of guilt. And only when he confessed his sin did he experience relief. But I do think some anxiety really is satanic in its nature. And I'm talking about this paralyzing kind of fear, this thought that comes out of nowhere that's prefaced by the words, what if? What if I catch the virus? What if I lose my job? What if my child is run over? What if? And when that kind of paralyzing fear comes, you don't want to read your Bible. You don't want to go to church. You don't want to do anything. That doesn't come from God. And that's 2 Timothy 1:7. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of love, power, and of a sound mind. And, there are a lot of things we can do to deal with that kind of satanic induced guilt. I think Paul has one of the best prescriptions in Philippians 4 when he says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. It wouldn't be enough to just say, don't worry. You don't help anybody when you tell them, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. That's like telling somebody, don't think about a pink elephant. Well, if you tell them that, that's all they're going to think about.
Right.
You've got to replace it with something else. Paul said, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. My friend David Jeremiah has a great suggestion for people who worry. He says, take a sheet of paper, put at the top of it my worry list, and then list everything you can think of that you're worried about. It may take 2 or 3 pages, but once you've exhausted everything you've ever have or ever could worry about, then take your pen, go back up to the top of the piece of the paper, and scratch out the word worry and put the word prayer. Turn your worry list into your prayer list. And Paul promises when you do that, the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus.
This reminds me of when I was in graduate school to be a therapist, and I remember having a conversation with you because I was so excited about everything I was learning about anxiety. And I was telling you about that a coping skill that I had learned to teach other people, and it was that a lot of anxiety comes from what if, and changing it to even if. And we call it worst case scenario planning. And anytime I work with people with anxiety, they're like, oh, I do worst case scenario planning all the time. No. Like it's go ahead and say, like your dentist example, oh, what if I go to the dentist and I have a horrible cavity or whatever your fear is, and changing it to, okay, even if I have a horrible cavity or have to have a root canal, and make a plan to deal with that. You make a plan to deal with your worst fear. And I was so excited to tell you about it. And I remember you saying, yeah, that's great. That's also in the Bible. Paul says to live as Christ and to die as gain. And I just think sometimes there are scriptures that we all know, like those are the popular scriptures to deal with certain issues, but there are also other ones, like to live as Christ and to die as gain actually really is helpful for those struggling with anxiety. I know we were both in that conversation with a friend that had been in a car wreck, and he was okay, but he said that famous quote, every person's invincible until God is done with him. And I know I didn't say that perfectly, or immortal, right? Okay, every person's immortal until God is done with them. And I mean, if we lived with that kind of, I mean, it's so freeing if we really, really believed that.
And when you have planned for that worst case scenario and see the benefits of that, then everything else you're worried about falls short usually of, of death.
Exactly. Yes, that's true. Okay, so we also talked about grief. There's grief in your book. And I know a lot of people I see them not recognize they're dealing with grief because a lot of people equate grief with the death. Well, no one died, or that's not what we're experiencing. And grief is actually any loss. Anytime we have loss, there's grief associated. So what help do you provide for those who are grieving?
Well, again, these last 18 months have been a season of grief for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who lost loved ones. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe they lost some friendships. Maybe they just have the feeling they've lost 2 years of time. But with any grief comes that, or with any loss comes that sense of grief. And I talk in the book about the fact that, as you said, grief is a normal response to any significant loss. There's not immediate healing. There's a process, as a counselor, that you go through. And, I have people all the time who say to me who've gone through some loss, Pastor, when will I start feeling normal? And my usual answer is probably never. But there's a new normal that you'll eventually come to that may possibly be as fulfilling as the old normal, but it's going to be different. And I tell people grief is like a tunnel. It's a dark tunnel you go through. It is dark. It can be frightening. It can be lonely. The good news is once you've started into that tunnel, you're already on the way out of it.
Wow.
And, the psalmist said it. He said, sorrow endures the night, but joy comes in the morning.
Wow. I want to end this conversation with you telling us, as we all look at what's going on in culture and just in our world in general, not just in America, why do we not have to be afraid?
Well, I think, first of all, everything's on schedule, on God's timetable. Nothing takes God by surprise. And everything we're experiencing in the world right now is exactly what Jesus predicted in Matthew 24 and 25. He talked about before his return to earth. There would be pestilence. That's another word for pandemic, literally.
Wow.
There's going to be strife. There's going to be unrest. There's going to be international tensions. Nations will rage against nations. So he said all of these things are going to happen. But that storm that's coming precedes the eternal brightness of Christ's return. And so, I would say whether we're talking nationally globally or personally, we ought to take encouragement from Jesus' words in John 16:33. He said, in this world you will have tribulations. Broken marriages, loneliness, grief, addictions, racial conflict, political division, all of that is part and parcel. That's the price we pay for living in a sin-infected world. In this world, you shall have tribulation, but then he added, be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. And that's why Christians can be invincible. We're invincible not because everything's already worked out in our life, but as Paul said, we are more than conquerors through him, Christ, who loved us. Christ loves us. He has a perfect plan for our life, and we will ultimately experience that plan one day when he returns.
Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Jeffress. Can you tell us how to connect with you, and who also has his own podcast, and where we can get your book?
Well, like Unapologetic, our program, Pathway to Victory, is a ministry of Pathway to Victory. And whether you want to find past episodes or the current episode of Unapologetic or episodes of our radio and television program, Pathway to Victory, you can go to ptv.org.
And your book is available everywhere?
It's available everywhere. It's called Invincible, and it's at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and, of course, ptv.org.
Thank you for being with us today.
Good to be with you, and congratulations on the success of Unapologetic.
Thank you for tuning in to Unapologetic. Today's episode was with my dad and pastor, Dr. Robert Jeffress. It is a wonderful episode to share with everyone, but especially those in your life that want to have invincible faith, are curious about deconstruction, or are struggling with anxiety. This is a very encouraging episode, and I thank you for tuning in. Make sure to listen to this episode and all Pathway to Victory programming at ptv.org and wherever you get your podcasts.